This is the second part of a discussion of Ignacio Ellacuría's essay, Laying the Philosophical Foundations of Latin American Theological Method. I want to continue now with a question for you. So what do you think comes first? Do we change our ideas and then change the world? Or do we change the world and then our ideas change? Which comes first, do you think? Do you think in order to change the world, you have to change your ideas about it first? Or do you think you got to change the world to have any chance of your ideas changing? Well, there are at least two different answers to that question. The ancient answer, the Greek answer, was change your ideas first. Seek wisdom. Our problem, according to the ancient Greeks, was a problem of ignorance. The Greeks believed, more or less, that if we knew the good, we would do the good. So the problem is not with our will to do the good. Our problem is with our understanding of what the good really is. So if we could really come to know ourselves truly and come to know the world truly, then we would have good ideas, and knowing the good, we would do the good. The problem, the reason why we do things that are not good is due to ignorance. Change your ideas, and then you can change the world. Karl Marx, who you've heard of, I'm sure, thought the opposite. He thought, change the world. And by that he meant change the concrete social arrangements in which we all live our lives, and our ideas will change accordingly. If we start doing things differently, we'll start thinking differently. Now, which is that? First answer, the Greek answer? Second answer, Marx's answer? Maybe some kind of combination? Well, that's a discussion. Ignacio Ellacuría says that it is not possible to do theology today ignoring Marxist theory. So we should at least take him at his word that far and try to learn at least a little bit in the next couple of minutes about some key elements of Marx's theory. The core of Marx's theory, the motivation, I guess, the underlying impetus for all that Marx did. And he did a lot and was very complex, and we will barely be able to scratch the very surface of it in the next couple of minutes. But the core impetus can be found in a famous little text by Marx called Theses on Feuerbach. And the most famous one of those is thesis number 11. Here it is. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Right? Philosophy is often understood to be an intellectual enterprise wherein one steps back from the world and gives one's best attempt to try to understand what the world is all about. So that once you have understanding, then you have it. Marx, on the other hand, said, no, the point is not just to understand what's going on, but to change it. Now, you know that's a controversial idea, because I think if we thought about this for more than a moment or two, a question would pop into our minds. Change it how? Change it why? Why does it need changing? Well, the answer to that is not all is well, of course. Marx thought, though, that if you change the material conditions, and the material conditions of his day, you have to remember, was, in modern industrial Europe in the 19th century, smokestacks and factories, and Germany being the most industrialized nation at that time, with a working class, a proletariat, as the term is, that had rough lives, very brutal lives. They were not paid very well. They worked in dangerous occupations. Life was difficult for the workers. Those were the material conditions. And Marx thought you need to change those conditions before you get people's ideas to change. In particular, whose ideas? Everybody's. Not just the proletariat, not those who were being taken advantage of in Marx's eyes, but also those who were taking advantage of them. Until you change the actual concrete arrangements by which people live their lives, it's very unlikely that anybody's ideas will ever change. What we think and value is determined, in Marx's view, by the material and economic basis of society. So I'm going to post up for you a graphic that kind of illustrates what Marx is talking about here. It's called the base superstructure kind of model. Again, this is very first grade rendition of this, just enough to give us some things to think about. Marx thought that at base, all societies had to deal with, first of all, what natural resources did the world provide for them? Did they live near the ocean? Did they live near the forest? Did they live where there were minerals and metals? What natural resources did the world provide? Because without those natural resources, we couldn't live. We need to take those natural resources and transform them with our labor into something that we can use to live. We have to, cut down the trees to build a house, or we have to, take some deer so that we can have some venison to eat, or take some fertile land and grow some crops so we have some food to eat, or fish those lakes or rivers. And how you do that, how you produce the things that we all need to survive and to live, can be very variable. There are all kinds of different ways, all kinds of different methods, all kinds of different strategies that any group of people could employ to transform natural resources into products that could be used for our convenience and our well-being. And once you create everything that you need, you have one more question. How do we distribute what's been produced? Who gets what and how much of that? And Marx thinks that every society has dealt with this issue one way or another. They've dealt with it very consciously and conscientiously, or they've dealt with it unconsciously and just sort of pushed ahead. But every society has some set of natural resources that they have to turn into something usable. And there are a variety of questions to be answered about how we're going to do that. And then there's the question of, once we've done that, who gets what? And you could say, well, that's easy. That's not really a big deal. Let's suppose you have fertile land. So what do you have to do? You have to farm. Well, that's what you do. You plant the crop, you harvest the crop, and you bake the wheat into bread or whatever. And who gets it? Well, who did the work? Who tilled the soil? Who planted the seeds? Who baked the bread? Those are the ones who should get the benefit of the products that have been produced. Seems pretty obvious, but it's not totally obvious. What about your children who aren't old enough yet to till soil and plant and bake? What about the old and the infirm? Are they no longer producing, so they no longer get anything? Or what about somebody who doesn't till the soil, or who doesn't harvest the crops or even bake the bread, but they, I don't know, play guitar? And they play some wonderful music that's very relaxing after a hard day of other people's labors. They enjoy music. It makes them feel good. They sing, they dance. What about the guitars? Do they get to have that? I'm not saying here's the exact right answer. I'm saying it's not as obvious as it may seem who gets the results of all the work. So natural resources, modes of production, and means of distribution. Every society deals with that one way or another, or the society is just non-functioning. Every society is like that. Ancient societies, modern industrial and technological societies, all societies have to cope with this. Okay, on top of that base, Marx says a cultural superstructure begins to develop in the light of it. So once you decide how you're going to produce and who's going to get the goods distributed to them and who's not. Once you do that, you start to set those practices down in stone, so to speak. You start to develop laws, you start to develop political institutions and practices that underwrite that decision, however that decision was made. However it was made. Was it made democratically? Was it made at a big town meeting where everybody decided? Or were there some people who had certain powers and strengths that imposed their will about how things were going to be done? However that decision gets made, and it always gets made, on top of that, there starts to develop the laws and the practices and the political institutions and so forth that reinforce that. So if we say, oh, well, here's our mode of production, everybody gets a little plot of land, we'll call that property, proper to each person. We'll write laws that reinforce that. Okay, if you have property, then that property is yours and no one can take it. Fine. The purpose of law and politics is to enforce those decisions. The purpose of law and politics is not to debate those decisions. The purpose of law and politics is to enforce those decisions. The purpose of government is to reinforce the economic practices of a given society. However just or unjust they are, that is their business. To reinforce and serve and protect those economic decisions, as Marx understand it. And then layered on top of our political and legal institutions are our ways of understanding ourselves, our ways of seeing ourselves. So for instance, our philosophical views are a function of the kind of society that we find ourselves living in. What's the purpose of science? Well, that depends on the kind of economic arrangements, the concrete material modes of production and means of distribution that have been adopted one way or another and reinforced by law and politics. Science could be for the sake of just communing with the natural world, or science, as it is in our society, is about technology. And technology in our society is about producing something for which we can make a profit. Whether it truly is useful or not is the secondary question. That might be a good selling point, but the point is to sell it. Our moral codes are a function of that economic set of arrangements. Our religions are there to reinforce our living under certain economic arrangements of production and distribution. Even our art, Marx says, will reinforce the vision of the world that's coming from this base. So a cultural superstructure on the base. So if you think about this model, you can see what Marx is talking about here. He says if we had a different arrangement for production and distribution, our laws and politics would be different. And our laws, and if they were different, our culture would operate differently, and our views about who we are and what's just and what's right, those would change as well. So just to give you an example, if you worked, as I did for many years, in let's say a small retail store. I used to work in a record store. Coolest job ever, by the way. Wish they'd bring those back. We're all downloading now, so none of that. Or streaming. We don't even download anymore. We just stream. It used to be a shop where you went and there were physical objects called records, and people came in, they bought them, and we listened to them and we talked about them. It was a very cool job, but it did not pay a lot of money. And if you worked at a job with a variety of people, maybe you've had this experience, there might be other people there who are making the same minimum wage as you are, but the person next to you doesn't work as hard as you do. And you start to resent that person. You say, wait a minute, why does that person get the exact same amount of money I do, which is not enough? It's barely enough to keep me alive and coming back the next day. Why do they get the same amount as I do, even though they don't do the same kind of work as I do? That's a very natural question. It's a very natural attitude to have. Nobody likes to feel like they're being taken advantage of. So it's a perfectly natural, normal way to feel. But we feel that way because we are in a very competitively arranged economic situation. We have powers that be who own those record stores when they had them, but not us workers. So they needed us to work, sure, but they only wanted to pay us as little as they possibly could pay us in order to make the most amount of profit as they can. So they said, okay, you want a job? You don't have a store, you don't have a business of your own, you got to come work for me. And you say, oh, I'll do it for $10. Somebody else says, wait a minute, I need a job, $9 is better than no bucks. I'll do it for $9. And you get a kind of a race to the bottom, don't you? A competitive race to the bottom. So you feel when you're already at the outer limits of what you would be willing to do, you'd be taken advantage of by a fellow employee. But if the arrangements were different, if you did not have to worry about so much about where your next meal was coming from, and whether you'd have a roof over your head, and whether you could get good medical care, and whether you could get an education and not be in debt for the rest of your natural life. If you didn't have to worry about those things, then work would be different. Work wouldn't be necessarily a battle of survival. It may be something that brings out our creative abilities, or our scientific or technological skills. We may look at it differently. Now, it's hard to imagine. That's exactly Marx's point. It's hard to imagine because we don't live in that society. We live in this society, and we look at things the way it makes a kind of sense to look at in this society. So if you were to change that basic arrangement to something else, you would have different ideas. At least that's what Marx argues. And Ellacuria, I think, adopts at least the gist of that thought process. I also wanted to say something about, while we're on the subject of Karl Marx, I think in many ways in America a very misunderstood thinker. Having said that, doesn't mean to say that he's everybody thinks he was wrong and he was right. Absolutely, no. He had interesting ideas, and that's kind of what Ellacuria is saying, and they're worth thinking about. Not necessarily adopting, but thinking about. Either he's right, and his ideas are worth adopting, or he's wrong, but it's nice to know why they're wrong. It helps us to avoid the mistakes that maybe Marx made in his understanding of us. So it's important to know about that. And one of the things Marx is sort of infamous for is his views on religion. And not just Marx's view, but societies who have taken up the banner of Karl Marx, called themselves Marxist societies, whether they were or not, have been very harsh on religious views. In the 19th century, there was a lot of critique of religion. You know the name Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote a book called The Antichrist, very, very negative on religion. Even religious believers like Kierkegaard were very brutal on Christendom, the culture that grew up that called itself Christian. Well, there's a lot of that in the air. And Marx wasn't the only one with criticisms of religion, but we mentioned Feuerbach. Marx wrote those theses on Feuerbach, but Ludwig Feuerbach was a German philosopher. He died in 1872, and he wrote a book, a very influential book called The Essence of Christianity. And in that, he argued that the religious views that humans have come up with, particularly sticking Christian, were high ideals, beautiful ideals. But for Feuerbach, they were projected out into a fantasy world. That these ideals, which express the highest potential of us human beings, have been alienated from us, from human beings onto fantastic gods. I mean, by fantastic, I mean they're fantasy for Feuerbach. So we've taken what our best views of ourselves, but we haven't lived up to those views. We've pushed them out onto the great beyond, the great by and by, onto the gods, and maybe we get a taste of that when we leave this mortal life, maybe in heaven. Feuerbach argued in that book, only by overcoming this alienation would we attain our full potential. We have to recapture those religious ideals for ourselves, get rid of the mythology behind it, get rid of this alienating tendency to push it off into a fantasy world, and take them back for ourselves. He gave an example of the Holy Family versus the earthly family. You know, the Holy Family of Joseph, who is quiet and supports Mary, who's with child in an extraordinary, miraculous way, and Jesus, who's the most extraordinary, and how that's all mutual love and support. And he says, what about the earthly family? Dad goes off to work at a dangerous factory somewhere, risking his life for exactly enough pay that keeps him alive and coming back the next day. So he takes his pittance of a paycheck and he stops off at the pub on the way home, and he drinks some of his paycheck away. He comes home drunk and angry and miserable from his rotten job and abusive to his wife and his children. That was a lot of factory life in industrial society at that time. We got to recapture those ideals, he says. Feuerbach is saying, change our ideas. Stop pushing those ideas out into something fantastic. Bring them back to ourselves, and all that miserable, impoverished, unhealthy behavior and societal practices will go away. Marx criticized Feuerbach on this. He said, but Feuerbach, if you ask him, like, are you a materialist or a religious person, or an idealist? Feuerbach said, oh, I'm a materialist. I don't believe in those gods and angels and all that kind of stuff. I'm a modern scientific kind of guy. I'm a materialist. Marx says, you know what, though? You're actually not a materialist. Not really. You're a crypto-idealist. Why? Because idealists believe that what comes first are the ideas. Change the ideas and the material world will change. Marx says, no, that's not right. Feuerbach is getting it all wrong. He doesn't understand where religion comes from. Religion is not the cause of problems in society. That's what Feuerbach thought. Religion, this alienated set of ideas, that's where all our problems come from. Get rid of religion, everything will be fine. Marx says, no, it's not the root cause of our problem, it's a symptom of our problem. So you might have heard the most famous line by Marx about religion, where he calls it the opium of the people, the opium of the people. Let me read the whole passage, though. It's a little bit lengthy, but worth it, because people pull this terrific quotable line out of this passage, but they don't really hear the whole thing. So let's hear it. This is Karl Marx in a book called A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, from the introduction. Marx: religion is indeed the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet won through to himself or has already lost himself again. But man is no abstract being squatting outside the world. Man is the world of man, state, society. This state and this society produce religion, which is an inverted consciousness of the world because they are in an inverted world. Religion is the general theory of this world, its encyclopedic compendium, its logic in popular form, its spiritual point d'honneur, its enthusiasm, its moral sanction, its solemn complement, and its universal basis of consolation and justification. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is therefore indirectly, the struggle against the world whose spiritual aroma is religion. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusion about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. The criticism of religion is therefore, in embryo, the criticism of that veil of tears of which religion is the halo. Now, to unpack that just a little bit, there's lots going on in there, but the basic idea of this: what is opium? It's a plant that provides us a morphine. And what's that? It's a painkiller. Marx is saying religion is a painkiller. And people need painkillers when they're in pain. So for instance, if you broke your leg and I had a painkiller and I refused to give it to you, that would be cruel. That would be heartless. I'd have no soul if I wouldn't provide you with a medication that would take away your pain and suffering. It's the broken leg that demands the painkiller, however. The broken leg comes first. If you mend the broken leg, you won't need the painkiller anymore. You won't need it anymore. Now, we know that people can become addicted to the painkiller. That's not a good idea. Well, religion is the painkiller of a world that's in pain, that's actually in pain because of its socioeconomic injustices. A lot of people are suffering and they need something to help them with that suffering. But the problem is not the morphine. The problem is the broken leg. The problem is not religion, Marx says. The problem is the material, concrete conditions that make something like religion possible. That's his basic argument. Now, whether you buy that argument or not is something else, but it's important to realize what he's saying. He's not arguing that religion in and of itself is a problem. It's a sign of a problem. It's a symptom of a problem. Fix the problem and the argument is it will go away. And if you want to see whether he has anything going for him on this point of view, if you could think about modern Europe. America's odd, as we know. But think about Europe. I don't know if you've had a chance to visit Europe, but we can't go visiting too much anymore these days with the pandemic we're all living through. But you know, if you've been to Europe and you've visited the wonderful, beautiful, beautiful churches and cathedrals throughout Europe, you'll notice that you rarely are interrupting any kind of religious service in any of those churches and cathedrals. They're basically museums now. They're basically museums of art, of architecture and stained glass and paintings and so forth. Why? Europeans mostly are not particularly religious anymore. They're not really churchgoers anymore. Why? Affluence. You know, so many people in Europe, a very wealthy part of the world, not that everybody in Europe is wealthy, but comparatively a very wealthy part of the world, they don't feel the need for what Marx would call a painkiller anymore, because they're out of pain. They have money. So affluence tends to reduce religious adherence, tends to. So maybe he's right. Doesn't always. Again, U.S., America, we are a different story altogether, and that's worth thinking about, and that's worth keeping in mind in mounting any kind of critique or counter argument to Marx's point of view. We don't want to lose that. But right now I'm just trying to get Marx's view on the table. Now, we also have to talk about something that's very important in understanding Marx, and also for understanding Ellacuria and for understanding Dussel, and that's the idea of dialectics. And dialectic is a kind of alternative to traditional logic. That's the best way to start thinking about this. You can almost hear the word dialogue or in the term dialectic. You have to think of it as a logic of a kind of give and take, a logic of a kind of back and forth. But that's different from traditional logic. So mini lesson in traditional logic. Basic principles of traditional logic can be formulated in certain laws. For instance, the law of identity. A is identical to A. A is A. The thing is what it is. Our version of the law of identity is it is what it is. Right? That's right. There's also the law of non-contradiction. A thing cannot be both A and not A in the same sense at the same time. A thing can't be both a cat and not a cat in the same sense at the same time. Something can be a cat and a pet at the same time, but that's different. It can't be both a cat and a non-cat at the same time. And finally, related to that is the law of excluded middle. Either A or not A. That covers it. Either that thing's a cat or it's not a cat. Whatever else it is, it's not a cat. And that covers it. It's hard to think how any of those three laws, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, it's hard to think how any of those could be wrong. It's hard to think how they could be wrong. It's hard to unthink those thoughts. But the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who was a very famous professor of philosophy in Germany, called these traditional laws of logic into question. And Hegel was very influential on the thought of Marx. So we just have to say a couple words about Hegel here and his understanding of dialectical logic. He thought, for instance, A is not A. And he thought that something is both A and not A at the same time. And it's not the case that it's either A or not A. Now, how do you think that? I mean, what is he talking about there? Well, okay, let's take an example. I'm a parent, right? What's that mean? What is it that makes me a parent? What is it without which I would not be a parent? Okay, there's a claim. I'm a parent. But when you think about what that claim is, let's call that the thesis here. He's a parent. What does it take for him to be a parent? The answer is what? Children, right? I have to have a child. I can't say, I'm a parent. Oh, how many kids do you have? Oh, I don't have kids. Oh, well, I'm sorry, what happened to him? No, I never had kids. You say, well, you don't know what you're talking about, right? You have to have a child in order to be a parent, right? But what's a child? Not a parent, a non-parent. Fundamental to my identity as a parent is something which is non-parent. In other words, children. Let's call that the antithesis, the opposite of what it is to be a parent, a non-parent. Okay? So to be a parent, to have that thesis be true, it automatically includes its antithesis, the non-parent, to make me what I am. But how do I make sense of that? Parents and children, I mean, how do I fully understand what's going on there, what it really means to be a parent or a child? The answer is parents and children form a family. Only in terms of the understanding of what a family is can you really make sense of parents and children, what it means to be a parent, what it means to be a child. Well, let's call that the synthesis, where we don't lose anything of the thesis or the antithesis, but we bring them up into a richer whole to help us understand each of the elements, the parents and the children. But you could just carry this on pretty easily. You say, well, okay, my family helps me understand who I am as a parent, who my children are as children. But what makes my family my family? The fact that it's not your family. That my family is what it is as a function of what it's not, which is not part of yours and not part of other people's, but mine. And how do I understand that? Well, Marx would say something like society. A society is a set of families. That's how you make sense of what's going on and what it means to be a family in our current context, what families are all about. You have to refer to society. And what makes one society what it is, the society is that it's not, right? And you can go on. And Marx carries on that thought that says, you go from a thesis, a positing of something, you rapidly find yourself at the antithesis. In order to understand what something is, you have to consider what it's not, what it's distinct from. And then you have to have an even deeper recognition that yields something new, something higher. The word in German is Aufhebung. It's you could translate it as sublation or transcends but includes, or the negation of the antithesis. So you got a thesis, you got a negation of that thesis, and then you got a negation of the negation that gives you something higher. Bottom line is, if you follow that all out, what's Hegel teaching? In order to understand anything fully, completely, totally, you have to understand everything. It's only at the level of the whole do any of the parts make any sense. Are the parts what they are as a function of their role or their place in the whole? Another very famous and very important example of dialectic, a dialectic that shows how we come to self-consciousness, is the famous master-slave dialectic story. So think about a slave owner and one who's been enslaved. The slave owner, the master, is conscious of himself and of another who is conscious but who is not himself, the enslaved person. For the master, the slave is a thing. It's an object for the master, who feels himself, sees himself as subject. The master perceives himself as free, and the slave as an object, an implement, a tool, not unlike any other piece of equipment. The slave, or the enslaved person, is conscious of himself as a thing, as an object, of being objectified. For one who is not himself, the other person, the master, the slave owner. So the slave perceives himself as in bondage. Now that part should seem obvious. The slave owner thinks of himself as free, and owning the slave, the person who's enslaved feels like an object, feels like a slave, sees the owner, the master, as the subject over him. Now, that all makes perfect sense. But what Hegel wants to say is, but think about what's really going on there, the dynamic of that. The slave owner feels that the slave is just an object, like any other kind of farm instrument to do with as he wishes. However, notice that the slave owner gets dogs and guns and chains, but not for the tractor and not for the plow, but for the slave, because the master recognizes that the slave is conscious of their situation and is not simply an object, but also a subject. In the meantime, the enslaved person recognizes that all the work that gets done is getting done by him, that it's his own labor that's creating the wealth, even though it's usurped by the master. So the master comes to see that he is who he is only in terms of the slave, and the enslaved person understands himself only in terms of the slaver. But the slave owner is also in a kind of bondage. I'm not saying it's equal. I'm not saying that anybody wants to trade places. It's a matter of the self-conscious awareness that both the slave owner and the enslaved person come to. The self-consciousness that they are what they are with respect to the other, but that relationship is unjust. It's unfair. The slave knows that if he wants to, if he wants to take that risk, he can break those chains. The slave owner knows that he's in bondage to the slave being a willing slave. And the minute the slave says, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore, the slave owner stops being who he is, the slave owner. So both are in bondage, and according to Hegel, both are free to free themselves from this bondage. Now, is that going to be easy? Is that going to happen quickly? Is that going to be painful? Is it going to be violent? Well, we know. We know what it takes to make that kind of change. But Hegel's point is there's a tension, there's an antithesis going on between slave owner and the enslaved person. And that tension needs to resolve somehow, and it resolves in ever greater freedom. The more free both of them are from this situation, this relationship that keeps them both in bondage, the freer they get, the more they can get outside of that system. And this idea is definitely taken over by Marx. Greco-Roman democracy, which you might have been taught in your history courses or world cultures or whatever, was a golden age. Well, it was a golden age because it's only possible to have democracy in those days because there were slaves. And somebody comes along, and I'm simplifying history very, very much here, but just to show this dynamic involved, somebody comes along and says, look, you don't have to be a slave anymore. You don't have to be in bondage to your master. You could come and work on my farm, and you could grow crops, and you could keep some for yourself. Well, how much can I keep for myself? Well, you could keep 1/10 of everything that you produce. Well, why can I only keep 1/10 if I produce 10/10 of everything that comes off this farm? Because, says the manor lord to the serf, that's who we're talking about here, I own the land. I own the land. If you don't like it, get yourself some own land, your own land. Well, that's not so easy to do, right? But slavery gives way to a kind of feudalism. It's a step forward in a certain kind of way, but the tension is there. There's still the manor lord and there's still the serf. We got rid of the slave owners and slaves, but we still have this unjust relationship. So somebody comes along and says, you don't want to work on that farm anymore? I got a new idea. Come on down to the city. We got a new thing called a factory, and you can work in the factory, and I'll give you money for doing that. And you can use that money on food or whatever else you want because it's your money. Well, that sounds pretty good. How much are you going to give me? I'm going to give you exactly what it takes to keep you alive and coming back the next day. Well, you say, I produce way more than that in value in my 10-hour or 12-hour workday. How come I don't get to keep all of that? Because you don't have a factory. You don't like it? Get yourself your own factory, which again, it's not so easy to do. So now you have a new, that's a step forward. There's the capitalist and there's the proletariat. The capitalist is the one who owns capital, which is the means to production. And the proletariat is the group of people who are wage slaves, so to speak. They work for wages that are paid by the person who owns the means of production. But you can see in every case, says Marx, there's always somebody who has the means of production, whether that's the slave owner, or whether that's the manor lord, or whether that's the capitalist, and there's somebody who has to come willingly and originally unwillingly to those who own the means of production, of making what we need to stay alive and to thrive and be as best as we can be. We have to go hat in hand to them and say, please give me a chance to do something so that I can stay alive. And Marx says that this tension will always try to resolve itself. That's why Marx thought eventually that communism would be inevitable. You might think, oh, communists, they really hate capitalists. You should read a little bit more Marx. Marx thought there was no engine ever invented by humans to produce abundance than the capitalist system. Nothing is better. But now that it has produced abundance, we don't need to have social injustice. We don't need to have somebody who has the means of production and somebody doesn't. If we all own the means of production, we have the technology, Marx thought, we have the industry, Marx thought, we have the knowledge to produce abundance, so nobody would have to go without. The only reason that there is poverty and hunger in this world really is not, lack of money or food. It's politics. It's our economic system. There's certainly, this is undeniable, there is certainly plenty of food. No one has to go to bed hungry. Well, Marx thinks those injustices are a function of this tension. He thinks this tension will have to be resolved at some point. It just will. So that was his view of history, that it was on this ever progressive pathway to greater equality and freedom over time, from slavery through feudalism, through capitalism, until the end of that which is the engine of history, class conflict. If you get rid of the two classes, the two main classes, those who own the means of production, those who don't, if you get rid of that class distinction, you get rid of the class conflict, and all of history has been the working out of these tensions between classes. That's Marx's theory in a simplified, simplistic even nutshell, to give you an idea of what's going on. But these ideas resonated with the thinkers in Latin America, where they could see that there were haves and have-nots, and the tensions and the violence that these tensions gave rise to. So we have hermeneutics that we talked about before, this interpretive situation that we can't ever finally extricate ourselves from, and now this idea of dialectical or dialectical reason, where we have to understand the parts in terms of the whole. Dialectics is in some ways metaphysical. It asserts that you can't understand the parts without understanding the whole. Truth is in the totality, and truth is dynamic. Truth isn't here. It isn't timeless once and for all, as Plato might have thought. It's on the way. We're on the way to truth and beauty and goodness. It's not that they were eternal and unchanging forms and we are limited participants in those forms, as Plato would say. Hegel's saying that truth is working its way out. Marx would say that truth and justice are working their way out. We didn't have them in the past, but we're on our way to those things. Hermeneutics, which is epistemological, it's about how we know things through interpretation, asserts that the context, the totality, interprets and configures each individual as much as the individual interprets and configures and contributes to the totality. This is a concrete expression of truth being respective in Zubiri's sense. So we're coming down to the end of this talk, and what we've tried to do here is pull out of this discussion of whether or not there's a Latin American method for theology, something that's uniquely Latin American, and to show what the thought process that's underlying that. The reliance on both hermeneutics and dialectics to not abandon the thought processes of the dominant group in order to liberate the oppressed classes. You can't totally jettison those, but you need to reinterpret them. You have to see the tensions involved in them and see how they might be resolved. So among the critical tools that we hopefully have pulled out of here, and they're all interrelated, from Ellacuria, we have the idea of disideologization and historicization, both of nature as well as of ideas. From others, Ellacuria mentions what's now been called the hermeneutics of suspicion. It's an interpretive strategy that always is a little bit suspicious of the stories that we're being told, because the stories we're being told that give us the backdrop of meaning might be in the service of some rather than others. That comes from a French thinker, Paul Ricoeur, which comes from Marx and from Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis. That psychoanalysis, you may know, says that there are unconscious drives that we're not aware of that are helping to configure us, and that has social implications. Also, Nietzsche, with his idea of genealogy of morals, where you say morals has a family tree. Morals developed over time, just like your family developed over time. Didn't have to be the way it is, just like your family didn't have to be the way it is. Your great-great-grandparents might never have met, but they did. So here you all are. And morality is like that. It develops over time due to people's interests, which benefits some and maybe not so much others. The hermeneutics of suspicion is an interpretive strategy to find out what's behind what's going on. Genealogy, as I mentioned, and also, as I talked about earlier, Jacques Derrida's idea of deconstruction, that there's really nothing outside of the text, meaning nothing outside of any kind of context, and the dynamics of the interpretive hermeneutical situation of being in a context, but contributing to the context, but being reconfigured by the context. It's not clean and easy to try to figure out what's going on, to try to figure out new ways to see things, and to try to figure out ways to do better, to try to figure out ways to not just survive, but to thrive, and to truly try to become as best as we can be. So I'll end this reflections on Ellacuria's essay by taking the summary that's given in the book, The Ground Beneath the Cross, that talks again about these three dimensions of our confrontation with reality: the realizing the weight of reality, the noetic dimension, shouldering the weight of reality, the ethical dimension, and taking charge of the weight of reality, the praxis-oriented dimension. If we're looking for method, if we're looking for a way, again, we at this point, I'm speaking in the place of Ellacuria and Latin American philosophers and theologians, looking for something that we can bring back to our own situation here in the year 2020 as we talk about this. What is that? The foundation would mean, trying to get to understanding, and it's difficult. It takes dialectical reasoning, it takes hermeneutics, and it's conditioned by our actual possibilities. The operations of that method would be, as we talked about, the historicization of concepts. We try to establish the relationship between our concepts, our lenses for seeing, and the reality that we hope to be seeing. It's a tension between a utopia and a propheticism, that's a critical contrast between our current situation and where we might want to go. Theologically, we would say that's the reign of God, or politically or ethically, we might say that's justice. Trying to find that tension between where we are and where we would want to go. When it comes to the ethical dimension, shouldering the weight of reality, it's being vulnerable or open to what's really going on. It's an option of place, where one places oneself, determines who one is and what one knows. So we have to look for the place to stand so that we really can fulfill the noetic dimension, really can see what's real. Operationally, that would be finding the place for that historicization process. Return to the place of greatest access to the real. And according to Latin American context, that's having an eye towards the persecution and the martyrdom of the poor majority. The verification that theology really is shouldering the weight. That really is the task of what they call in theology soteriology, our thoughts and reflections about the nature of salvation, what salvation really means. And then finally, the praxis-oriented dimension, the taking charge of the weight of reality, calls for transformative action, where we create capacities and actualize possibilities in a transformative manner, again, to liberate ourselves from the various bonds that prevent us from being the best we can be. In other words, in order to liberate. And again, operationally, that's historicization as an actual praxis. Deploy a modified, kind of dialectics and theory. At least in theology, that would be a kind of ecclesial praxis when you take what you've learned and do something with it. Now, that's the summary of what Ellacuria is doing in this essay when it comes to what was interesting to him in his situation, how to find a uniquely Latin American method for theology in a real context, a context in which there are massive numbers of poor and oppressed, and somehow the gospel needed to be preached there. That was his problem. Maybe our problem is different. We are in a much different country at a much different time. Even in the 40 or so years since Ellacuria wrote this essay, how many advances in technology and communication and networking and social media, how many of those things didn't even exist when Ellacuria was writing his essay? But they exist for us. They're part of our context. We have helped to create that by our actions and deeds and choices and how we spend our time. And all of those elements of the context are shaping and reshaping who we are. And to find out first whether we're in bondage, and second of all, take responsibility for the reality of our situation, and third of all, act to see whether in fact we can be freer, better, healthier, more how we're meant to be. That's the underlying structure of what's going on. This essay is an example of that in a given context. The key we have to take away from this for us is that all of these thinkers that we're studying, Zubiri, Ellacuria, Dussel, all of them will insist that you cannot think truly, you cannot think really, you cannot know for sure unless you understand the context in which you're in. There's no contextless place to stand. And as they say, you never really know until you act, until you do, till you take responsibility for the life that you find yourself in. That's the teaching that they're making here. And these are some of the tools, dialectics, hermeneutics, historicization, disideologization. These are some of the tools that are put on the table for us to engage in that beginning step in the process of liberation, should we find, in fact, that we need it.